The gates do not hesitate. They open because they have been told to open, and a girl of 13 or 14 passes through them into the world of Tang Taizong's inner court. A world whose entire architecture has been designed, with centuries of accumulated precision, to ensure that women like her remain exactly where they are placed. It is approximately the year 637 of the Common Era. The dynasty is 20 years old, and its emperor is at the height of what posterity will call a golden age. The city of Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Empire, the largest and most deliberately constructed city in the medieval world, arranges itself outward from the palace complex in a grid of extraordinary deliberateness. Broad avenues, walled wards, the geometry of an empire that has decided exactly what order looks like and built an entire capital to prove it. At the center of that center, behind walls within walls, the inner court operates on its own arithmetic. Several hundred women distributed across formal grades of rank, organized by proximity to a single man, governed by protocols so precise that a woman's standing can be read without a word spoken in the distance from which she is permitted to approach the Son of Heaven. She is given the title Siren, a lower rank, not the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. The grades beneath it held their own populations of women in their own conditions of managed distance, but a designation that placed her far from the elevated consorts whose rank carried genuine proximity to power, and far from the emperor's sustained attention, lost in practical terms in the arithmetic of hundreds. Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. Her name is Wu Zhao. She is the daughter of Wu Shuhuo, a timber merchant who had backed the right house in the wars of succession that produced the Tang dynasty, and who had been rewarded for that judgment with a ducal title and a series of high ministerial and gubernatorial posts. The old aristocratic families, the established Gualong clans whose lineages predated the Tang itself, despised his merchant origins regardless of what the dynasty had given him. That contempt had a specific social texture, and it followed his daughter through the gates with her. Whatever formal rank Wu Shuhuo had accumulated, the inner court of Tang Taizong was a world whose hierarchies of blood and lineage did not automatically yield to the hierarchies of official appointment. Every woman inside it understood from the first morning exactly where she stood in relation to every other woman, and exactly what would be required to stand somewhere else. Before a single word of her biography can be offered with confidence, a problem must be named. The primary narrative sources for Wu Zetian's life, the Old Tang Shu, compiled in 945 of the Common Era, and the New Tang Shu, compiled in 1060, were written, respectively, approximately 240 and 350 years after the events they describe. Both were produced by scholars working within a historiographical tradition that had, by the time of their compilation, already absorbed decades of deliberate effort to frame Wu Zetian as a cautionary aberration, a woman whose assumption of imperial power was, in the vocabulary of the men who recorded it, a disorder of nature requiring explanation in the most damaging terms available. These chronicles are not neutral archives. They are arguments constructed after her fall by scholars who already knew what conclusion they were building toward. This is not a minor qualification. It is the condition within which everything that follows must be understood. The archive is a hostile witness. When it speaks, it must be heard as such. What the record does establish with reasonable consistency is the structure of the world she entered. The Tang imperial inner court was one of the most administratively complex private environments in the ancient world. Its hierarchy of consorts, ladies, and attendants was not merely a domestic arrangement. It was a political apparatus. The women within it were, in a precise administrative sense, instruments of dynastic continuity, their function reproductive, their status entirely derivative of the emperor's attention, the system governing their lives refined across preceding dynasties to minimize the possibility that any individual woman could accumulate influence independent of the role she had been assigned. A lower-ranking siren occupied the outer edges of that system. The title indicated ceremonial eligibility for access to the emperor's presence, not regular access, not personal access, but the formal possibility of attention that the ranking system required to exist. In practical terms, a siren in a court of several hundred women was unlikely to command the notice of the man at its center with any frequency. The inner court's hierarchy was self-reinforcing. Proximity produced favor, favor produced elevation, and elevation produced proximity. A recursive logic that left women in the lower grades in a structural condition whose most accurate description was managed invisibility. The emperor at the center of this system was not a man to be rendered as background. Tang Taizong, the reign name of Li Sherman, second emperor of the Tang, is among the most celebrated rulers in Chinese history. His Zhengguan period, which ran from 626 to 649, established administrative precedents and cultural standards against which subsequent dynasties would measure themselves for centuries. He had won the throne through military ferocity that his own court's chroniclers recorded without apology. He governed through administrative reforms that reorganized the machinery of imperial rule at every level. He patronized literature and scholarship and debate with the genuine appetite of a man who understood that the quality of his court's thinking had direct bearing on the quality of his empire's functioning. The world Wu Zhao had entered was not a gilded enclosure erected around the margins of power. It was the operational center of one of the most sophisticated empires on earth, a world of policy competition and bureaucratic precision and intellectual ambition that extended in every direction to the edge of walls she was not, by virtue of her rank and her sex, permitted to cross. She was 14 years old, and the records suggest she stayed 14 years old in the empire's estimation for a very long time. What modern scholarship has established from the evidence of her later life is that she was literate, not ceremonially so, but substantively. The writings that survive from her years in power, the administrative documents that bear her hand, the poetry and political argumentation that can be traced to her directly, demonstrate a command of classical Chinese letters that does not improvise itself in adulthood. The formation that produced it had to have begun earlier. The inference, and the record requires honesty, it is inference, not documentation, is that the 12 years inside the inner court were not empty years. That a woman of her evident intellectual capability used the particular conditions of that confinement as a kind of education its architects had not intended to provide. The protocols of the inner court were rigid and documented. What moved within them, what a mind of sufficient quality could observe and absorb across a decade of proximity to the administrative center of an empire, that is not in the record. The record leaves only a shape, a young woman of demonstrated intelligence inside the most politically sophisticated environment in the medieval world for 12 years watching. The watching is inference. The intelligence is not. The personal relationship between Wu Zhao and Tang Taizong is, in the primary sources, almost entirely opaque. She entered as a Tsaren. She was still a Tsaren when he died. 12 years, and the system had not found reason to move her. A later hostile tradition would elaborate a narrative of transgression, suggestions of improper intimacy, moral corruption, the architecture of a smear that later chroniclers would deploy to darken everything that followed. That construction is legible for what it is, and this script will not repeat it as established fact. What the scholarly record does establish, and here caution rather than invention is the appropriate instrument, is the more pragmatic likelihood of a quieter convergence in the final years. Taizong's health declined across the last period of the Chang'an era. His son, the Crown Prince Li Jur, the future Gaozong, attended his father through that decline, as proximity to a dying emperor was both filial duty and political necessity. Modern scholars, including Rothschild, note the probability that during those difficult, closely attended final months, Li Jur encountered the Tsaren who had been present in the inner court for the better part of a decade. What formed between them in that space, whether recognition, regard, or simply the particular attentiveness of two people navigating the same constrained and grief-weighted environment, is not documented with certainty, but that it was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. On that point, the scholarly consensus is reasonably firm. The primary sources offer this not as romance, but as the consequence of circumstance. Two people in close proximity to a dying emperor. The rest is what came after. Tang Taizong died in the summer of 649 of the Common Era. He was 50 years old. He had governed an empire of perhaps 50 million people with a thoroughness and administrative intelligence that the centuries following him would not quickly surpass. Tang court protocol was clear, and it was absolute. Concubines who had borne no children were to enter Buddhist religious life upon the death of the emperor. It was not, by the logic of the world that produced it, cruelty. It was administration. The inner court had received these women, ranked them, housed them, organized their existence around a single dynastic function. When the man who defined that function ceased to exist, the function ceased with him. The women whose lives had been organized around it were redirected into institutions the Tang state considered an appropriate resolution of the question they now posed. Wu Zhao entered Ganye Temple. She was 26 years old. The ceremony of entry required the shaving of the head. The layered silks of the inner court gave way to gray monastic robes. The protocols that had organized her existence for 12 years, the ranked distance, the formal hierarchies of access, the calibrated visibility of a system built to keep its contents sorted and contained, gave way to the protocols of a religious community whose every practice communicated, without ambiguity, that the lives conducted within its walls were lives that had been concluded. The new emperor, Tang Taizong's son, 21 years old, ascending to the governance of an empire his father had spent a lifetime constructing, occupied the throne. The administration of a civilization continued its business. The machinery of the Tang state, which had never paused for the concerns of a Zetian, did not pause now. In the silence of Ganye Temple, a woman of 26 who had spent 12 years inside the most politically sophisticated court in the medieval world, shaved her head and folded her hands and became, in all observable respects, finished. The gate of the temple closed. The system noted the matter resolved. It had, by every measure available to it, arrived at the correct conclusion. It had not. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.